I first became familiar with John's work several years ago through his prolific writing in Canadian newspapers and magazines. He writes primarily about urban affairs, politics, planning and development, and climate for various media, including the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Walrus magazine, and Spacing magazines. One of his previous books, titled Dream States: Smart Cities, Technology, and the Pursuit of Urban Utopias, won the 2022 Writers' Trust Award for Public Policy. John is also a co-editor of several Coach House anthologies, including The Ward, The Life and Loss of Toronto's First Immigrant Neighborhood. No Jews Live Here is John's fifth and by far most personal book to date. John, welcome to Book Talk. And why don't we begin with you giving our audience a very brief sense of what No Jews Live Here is about?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Robert, and thank you for having me. And I appreciate all of you for coming and listening in. Um, so this book is basically follows several strands of my family's histories, both on my mother and father's side, going back a few generations. They all came from Hungary. In this, I pick up their stories sort of at the beginning of the 20th century. They were all Hungarian Jews. Some of them, one side of the family were converted, the other side wasn't. And they kind of lived through this, very tumultuous period when they went from being comfortable and middle class and living in Budapest, which was a very welcoming city for Jews, to the war and the dislocation and the devastation of that experience, and then the Hungarian Revolution, and then leaving to come to Canada. And what I wanted to do with this book is this really. I grew up with a lot of these stories. Some of them I had to find on my own. And I've always been keenly aware of the fact that these stories are really shaped by the history of those times. And this is kind of a trite observation, but when you see it up close, as I did because I heard a lot about them, I heard a lot of these stories. It made me kind of think about sort of putting these two pieces together, right? And almost situating the members of these two families and against the backdrop of these broader events, and trying to make sense of what happened to them, vis-a-vis these broader historical moments and junctures.
I'm sure many people are intrigued by the almost provocative title, No Jews Live Here. Maybe you can explain already what that title actually denotes.
Okay, so this is a story that is, kind of elevated to the status of mythology. It's a true story, and it occurred to my mother and my uncle and my grandmother in the late fall of 1944. This was a moment when the Hungarian fascists had carried out a coup in Hungary. It was a very, very precarious time, and they were living in an apartment building on the Buda side of Budapest, which is the side with the castle. And it was not a Jewish house. There were a lot of Jewish houses in Budapest at that time because the Jewish residents were being sort of herded into the ghetto and into, Jewish only houses to prepare for deportation. This one had a mixed tenant profile for whatever reason. And one day, my mother and her brother and my grandmother heard like the sound of trucks arriving in front of that apartment, bunch of guys getting out, the clomp, clomp, clomp of boots, shouting, and their apartment was on the fourth floor, and they could hear that these guys, who they quickly identified as Arrow Cross, they were the Hungarian fascists, were kind of going door to door, coming up the apartment, and basically taking people out of their residences. So the Gentile tenants had been given signs that say "No Jews live here." Um, so my grandmother, who was a real character, and I explore her character, her many many facets in the book, uh, had become by that point in the war somebody who was really attuned to survival, and so she stuck her head out of the door of their apartment and um, noticed, remembered that her neighbors, the Gentiles with the sign, were away. And so she dashed out into the corridor, grabbed that sign, and hung it on the door of their apartment. Um, and then when these guys came upstairs, they saw the sign and passed by the apartment. So that's why the title is what it is. There's a coda, which is that a couple days later they came back and they rounded up everybody who was left in that apartment, Jews, Gentiles, everyone, and marched them away. Um, in 2010, we went to Budapest with my mother and my wife and my kids and my sister, and she showed us this apartment building. And it's a very kind of ordinary Middle Europa building. It's got a sort of a Bauhaus vibe to it. It's got yellowish stucco, nothing you would think about twice. And she told us this story. I've heard this story many times. I've told it many times. Um, but she told it to my kids, who were in their early, like they were tweens at the time, while we were sitting on a low wall outside this building. And I think it was a very impactful experience to hear that story in that spot. And and I said to her after she finished, have you been back here since because she visited Hungary many times, and she said, no, I haven't been back to this apartment since we were marched away in 1944. So that's the story of the sign.
Wow. No, it's an excellent title for the book. Uh, the
I should have said this is a spoiler alert, but
well, you can blame me for asking the
yeah.
question. The one of the things I really impressed me about the book, John, is the wealth of information and knowledge that you share about several generations of your family in Hungary and that country's somewhat checkered history, especially as it relates to its Jewish population. You obviously did an immense amount of research in writing the book. I'd be curious to know, was there something that surprised you while you were doing this research? Anything that you uncovered that you hadn't expected?
I ended up reading quite a bit about the social history of Hungarian Jews in the latter part of the 19th century. And um, the story of Hungary's Jewish communities, plural, is, kind of, it has two facets. One is the assimilated part, and the the assimilation occurred because of emancipation decrees that date back to the 1860s, and they became very assimilated. They were thoroughly part of Hungarian society, and many of that group ended up in Budapest, and the much more religious, traditional side of the Hungarian Jewish communities was predominantly rural, and a lot of it was based in what is now Western Romania, um, and uh, so I ended up doing quite a bit of research about the social history, and it was quite fascinating. Um, Central European University, which was George Soros project and was kicked out of Hungary. They have a they have a publishing operation, and they publish some great social histories of Hungarian Jews. And what comes out is that this was a community that was able to take advantage of a lot of freedoms that had been made available to them, you know, through the latter part of the 19th century. And I think that in a interesting way, um, while Hungary was further east than um, Germany, obviously, and Austria, it was more. its assimilation narrative was more like Germany and Austria than as compared to Slovakia or Poland or Romania, where the segregation between the Jewish and Gentile populations was much more pronounced. Um, the other thing that I learned a lot about was the degree to which Budapest, and particularly the Pest side, um, which is the east side, and it's the flat side, was a city that was really shaped by Jewish immigration in the latter part of the 19th century. In a way that, it was a little bit like Warsaw. It had a very large Jewish population. Um, and, it was a good place to live, right? It was a place where you could basically be whatever you wanted to be. Um, and, so my parents were born in 26 and 32. Um, and, at the time my father was born in 1926, Budapest was still a place with a lot of opportunity, a lot of freedom. Hungarian Jews identified themselves first as Hungarians and then as Jews. And it didn't take long for that storyline to shift 180 degrees.
I see. In the book, you get the reader gets the impression that you've been living a lot of this story for many, many years. Uh, so I'm wondering what prompted you to write the book now, as opposed to 10 or 20 years earlier.
Uh, there's a good question. There are a couple of answers to this. I have written aspects of my family's story in different media. I wrote a fairly long feature in the Globe and Mail a bunch of years ago. I tried to do a piece on one aspect of story of about a farm that my mother's family owned. Um, for anyone on the call who's tried to write about family history, it's a difficult thing, right? Because it's right here in front of you. You're aware of all the people who will read it. Um, so I think that you have to kind of mature into this kind of writing. Um, the second thing is that a more specific stimulus that my mother is alive and she's living in a retirement home in around Bathurst and Eglinton, and she's 92. She tells great stories. I've heard a lot of those stories before, and during the pandemic, we would visit often, but outside on the patio behind her retirement home, and she would tell these stories because she's bored and she didn't really have other stuff to do. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to put the my tape recorder on and just keep, capture them, right? Because, my kids might be interested at some point. And then, I ended up connecting with somebody who's on the call, who's a former colleague from Toronto Life, and whose family had a very similar experiences during the war as my father's family. And we ended up talking during the pandemic by Zoom. And this friend was working on her own family story to be published in a magazine. And from those conversations, I thought, I got to get off my ass and just do this. And that's what I decided to start. And I pitched the idea to my publisher at Coach House Books, who says yes a lot more than she says no. And that's how it started.
You begin the book with the words of the late Jewish writer and university professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who actually specialized in Jewish history. I'm interested, why did you choose this quote of his to begin the book? You don't have to be Jewish to be a compulsive interpreter, but of course it helps. Why do you begin the book with that?
Well, so I ended up reading this book. I wasn't familiar with this work, but I was doing a bunch of reading, and I ended up reading Holocaust memoir by Marcia Lederman, who writes for the Globe and Mail, and she cited him in her account, and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to follow up, and I read one of his books, and sitting at the end of a dock at a cottage that we rent, um, and that line just sort of really kind of rang true for me. Like I think that part of what my own intellectual journey with this is to, be interpreting what happened. Like, why did these things happen? And uh, I think that these things happened to a lot of Jewish people, and there was a tremendous amount of randomness in what happened. Right? This is a story that's told across survivors of the Holocaust. Right? That things that just fleeting moments made an entire life or eradicated an entire life. So I do find myself interpreting a lot of this material. Um, the second quote, Robert, I'm going to mention is from Salman Rushdie's The Midnight's Children. And it is the line is, the story you begin is not necessarily the story you end. And I think that also, I was trying to articulate this idea that, the people that I populated this book with, began their lives in a way that I think all of us, could relate to. They lived comfortable lives. They weren't really being threatened at all in a significant way. They felt themselves to be Hungarians. And then, you know, by 1938, they were feeling much less so. And, things just went from there.
You spoke earlier, John, about Budapest and the role it played, particularly in your book, and in your treatment of Hungarian history. Uh, Budapest looms large, and where in the early 20th century, you mentioned in the book actually that they accounted for a quarter of the population, which is quite amazing.
Yeah.
And something I didn't know, which I learned in your book, that it even gave way to the nickname of Budapest of Judapest, which I had not heard that before. Uh, how much time did you end up spending in researching for the book? How much time did you spend in Budapest and elsewhere in Hungary in preparing for the book?
So the last time I was in Budapest was well before I started the book, but I've been to Budapest many times. Um, I was taken as a child and went back, a few times as a young adult. My wife and I happened to be traveling through Europe in the fall of 1989. We ended up spending a month in Budapest. My mother had a first cousin who lived in Budapest, and we often, spent time visiting with her. So it's a city that is quite familiar to me. It's a very beautiful city. And, living there for a month during the fall of 1989, we felt very embedded in the city. As I tell in the book, when we went back with my kids and my mother, my sister, we happened to see, a neo-Nazi demonstration. And this was in 2010. And not for the first time, because I'd seen them before in Budapest. So it is this complicated place, right? Because it's a place that, has this amazing history, that's not just Jewish history, it's a Gentile history as well. It's got, it's just a great city, but it's got these hatreds and it's got these scars of, both the war and the revolution. And these are both physical and psychological scars. And you can see them when you're there. And I think some of them are not really resolved or addressed. I'd like to go back to Budapest, but I'm not going to go back until Orban is out.
Mm-hmm. As if your parents didn't live through enough by surviving the Holocaust. You mentioned in the book how just over a decade following the end of World War II, their lives were upended again, this time by the Hungarian Revolution and then the subsequent invasion uh, by the Soviet troops, which prompted their departure for Canada. In your writing about that chapter of their lives, you touch on this age-old question of Jews whether or not to flee anti-Semitism, and you quote a Russian-American journalist by the name of Masha Gessen, and I want to share with our audience the quote from her that you include in talking about this whole issue when Jews are confronted with a situation, should they leave or should they stay? And here's the quote, and I will read it by Masha Gessen that you quote. When should the Jews stay put And when should the Jews run? How do we know where we will be safe? Does departure ever signal cowardice? Can the failure to leave be a betrayal of life itself? There is only one answer to any given question at any given time. And how can I tell when the time has come to know the difference? Unquote. After you include that quote, you then write, I believe my parents knew when the time came. What do you actually believe your parents knew, and how did they know it?
Okay, so the first thing I want to do in responding to your question is note the time difference between the end of 1940, between the end of the war in April of 1945 and the Hungarian Revolution in October of 1956. This is 11 years. And so you think back, everybody on this call, think back what you were doing when 11 years ago. And, for many of us, not that much different, right? I for sure have shoes that I had 11 years ago. And, in the safe world of Toronto or wherever else, your colors are on, it goes by fairly quickly and uneventfully. I mean, there are events, but they don't kind of come at you. So for my parents and a lot of the Hungarian Jews who survived the Holocaust, and by which I mean primarily people from Budapest, because they were the ones who sort of dodged the bullet, they spent those 11 years kind of putting their lives back together. They had access to universities which had been denied them. They were able to, kind of, make professions and just, kind of live a little bit more normally, despite the fact that the Hungarian regime at the time, the communist regime, was very oppressive, like very oppressive, and there was a very active secret police, and people disappeared. So it wasn't a normal quote unquote experience, but it was it was you know uh, it was stable, let's put it that way, for that group. And then 56 happens, and I think a lot of people, including in my parents' circle, were kind of excited about 56 because the as I mentioned before, the Rákosi regime, he was the Secretary General of the Hungarian Communist Party. He's not a good guy, um, and uh, there's a story that I was told that during all the demonstrations and all the sort of upheaval in Budapest as the revolution was going on, um, my parents were wandering around and seeing what was going on, and they were young, they were kids, right? They were, uh, you know, 30 and 24, and they witnessed lynching, and the 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 way the lynching, what the crowd was yelling was, "Kill the communist or kill the Jews," sort of uh, uh, either one. And this was because there were a lot of Jews who were senior people in the Communist Party, including the Secretary General. And I think they reckoned at that point that they'd seen enough. Like enough had happened in a fairly short amount of time that they wanted to get out and they didn't want to stick around. And it's not because they were living as an outwardly Jewish life. There were, they had kind of completely buried that part. They were totally secular, but they knew that there was a risk, or they sensed that there was a risk. And consequently, the proportion of Jews who left Hungary was quite high relative to the population of the country itself. And, those were only the ones who answered the question, "Are you Jewish?" on surveys or questionnaires. When the, immigration officials were taking tallies, there were lots of people who would have just not answered at all. Um, and I think that collectively they understood that this was a risky situation, that a populist uprising, which is what the Hungarian Revolution was a risky thing to sort of to witness, and they left. Not all their friends left, and many of their friends stayed. They lived comfortable lives, they had successful careers, and so on. So the apprehension of that risk did not materialize, which is great, but they nonetheless felt it.
You mentioned, John, in the book that you only learned that you were Jewish when you were 10 years old, and that adding to the weight of that revelation, your father gave you strict instructions to keep that a secret, which you say you did for many years. I'd be interested to know what was the impact of all that on you, learning that at a fairly young age and then being told to keep it a secret.
So let me back up for a second because this happened exactly to my mother when she was about 11. Um, and uh, and I relate this story in the book, and she found it very shocking because she, by that age, was well aware of the anti-Semitism in Hungarian society. For me, it was like it was 1973 or 74. I lived in North Toronto. It didn't mean anything. It was just like it was a piece of information. I think I was kind of interested in World War II stuff, like a lot of boys are. Um, and I, um, and so it didn't feel like it didn't feel like something that was a source of shame. I didn't really understand it. I remember asking him, you know, how could you tell the difference between Jews and non-Jews if everybody dresses the same? Um, and but I did, when you're presented with that, with something like that, you keep the secret. So I kept the secret. Didn't tell anybody until I was in university.
So that's quite a long time then that you kept it a secret.
Yeah, yeah. And
And what prompted you to finally reveal that?
well, turns out that North Toronto was not a very dangerous place for Jews in the 1970s. Um, and, when I got to university, I got involved with the student newspaper, and there were lots of Jewish kids who, came from Forest Hill or, further up Bathurst, who were involved with the student newspaper. I, became friends with a lot of them. And, I realized that they were they didn't keep anything a secret. They were just Jewish kids who lived in Canada, and that was that. Um, for me, the complicating factor was that there was this complicated explanation that was required. If I said, I'm Jewish, but I don't actually go to synagogue. I don't, we do Christmas like every other Hungarian Jew does. It's like there were a lot of explanations required. So I just, I kind of, I was uh, economical in how I shared the information, but eventually I realized, and this is the process of learning while you're growing up, that, that the, simply going to synagogue doesn't make you a Jew, right? So it, I became more interested in the history of, in the cultural existence of Hungarian Jews, which is, what I tried to get at in this book, which is quite specific. It's quite historically and socially determined. And it's not like a lot of stories in other parts of Central Europe.
Just to remind everyone, please feel most welcome to pose any questions you have for John, just to write them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them later in the program. Since so much of the story, John, is personal, was it therapeutic, the writing of the book for you?
Well, I don't consider myself to have been traumatized by these stories. Um, a lot of my mother's stories were very sunny, and they were about things she remembered from growing up on a farm when she was a little kid, and some of them were quite funny. And then there were stories about the war. My father never told any stories, but it didn't feel injurious. And I know people whose parents were Holocaust survivors, were in concentration camps, and that's a different kind of experience. And so I did not have that experience. Um, it was I was glad to be able to capture those stories, and take, this recollections from my mother and just hold on to them, put them on a piece of paper because I didn't want them to be lost, right? I want my kids to be able to have access to them. but then I realized that I want to find out more, and especially more about, you know, the, the stories from my father's side, and they were not recounted at all. And so, I'm a journalist, right? I like to kind of report on things and, put it down. I don't want to be too spockish about this and say that it wasn't cathartic in any way. Like it was a great experience to write the book. Um, but I don't consider it to be an exercise. I didn't consider it to be an exercise in sort of exercising, anything that had been pent up in me. It was a lot of it was driven by curiosity.
See, I found clearly the part of the book about the Holocaust in Hungary I found most riveting, and of course you describe how the actually the Holocaust, the worst part of the Holocaust, came to Hungary late in the war, in a sense, and that the mass deportations were actually starting to unfold while there were parts of Europe that were starting to be liberated from the Nazis. Did any of this in any of this these aspects about the Holocaust, were any of this new to you when you started writing the book, or were you already familiar with these details?
So one of the things that I wanted to do when I started writing the book, and what occurred to me when I was sort of, kind of itemizing all these old stories that my mother told about her childhood, was to try to align them with what was going on outside the viewfinder of a 6-year-old. And, you know, we all have kids and grandkids in some cases, right? And you're aware of things that the children are not aware of. And so I wanted to sort of reconstruct in my book, what was happening in the world beyond, and how, what was happening in the lives of, my parents in their specific realms. And so this aligning of timelines, became something I was really focused on with the book. And so you know, everybody who's on this call, who's connected to Hungary, everybody knows, March of 1944, October 1944. These are very significant dates, and it didn't actually dawn on me until I was well into the research, what to ask what else was happening. And so the mass deportations in the rural part of Hungary took place between May and July, right? 440,000 people were deported, 12,000 a day on trains to Auschwitz. Um, uh, at this point, um, thousands of Allied soldiers landed in Normandy, were pushing through, um, France, liberating Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg. The Soviet forces, on the other hand, were kind of sweeping in, liberating large parts of Eastern Europe. The Italians had surrendered. So basically, things were going really badly for the Nazis. And then, right, like just 6 months before the end of the war, or not 6 months, but like a year, 6 months to a year, they said, okay, well, we got to do something about Hungary. Hungary is like the one place in Europe that has not gone through this ethnic cleansing program that we wanted everybody to do. And then that's when they turned their attention to Hungary. And so consequently, you get this weird split screen where you have like Eisenhower and Patton and Montgomery doing these heroic things on the one side of Europe, and Eichmann and Ferenc Szálasi, the Air Cross leader, doing these horrendous things in Hungary, all at the same time.
John, why do you say in the book that it's no coincidence that Hungary was one of the last of the European countries to formally apologize for its role in the Holocaust, particularly its active participation in the deportation of so many Jews, so many of its own people?
Well, I think that so during the communist era, um, and this happened in East Germany as well, there was a downplaying of Hungary's role, and a realignment of where we should point fingers, right? Where, who was responsible for fascist regimes. Um, and then 1989 happens. Um, there's there are elections and changes in government. For the last many years, Viktor Orban has been the prime minister of Hungary. Has run this illiberal regime. Is very, I think, very legible to a lot of Hungarian Jews as an old school Hungarian fascist. And it's amazing to me that, and I think this was genuinely a surprise that Hungary did not apologize for its role in the Holocaust until 2014, right, 10 years ago, and still has not properly made reparations, despite the fact that there were these huge, huge crimes that were perpetrated. And uh, you know, Orban has made George Soros into a Jewish cartoon villain, right? They banned Central European University. These things are all, to my mind, suggest a society that hasn't really come to terms with its past.
What do you hope people who read your book will gain from the book itself?
Well, so one thing we haven't talked about with respect to this book is what I originally wanted to do was write about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was somebody I grew up with. She was in our house a lot. She was like a complete character. She wore this crazy costume jewelry and like loud outfits with high heels and traveled all over the place in a bus. And basically her life began great creature comforts, no expectation of anything of her. And then she became this, she turned into this incredibly resourceful survivor. I'm here because of her. And during the war, and then she left and reinvented herself twice, in exile in Canada, first in Montreal and then in Toronto. Um, and she was a real character. The working title for this book was Best Appreciated from Afar. Like she drove everybody around her crazy because she was so blunt. She had no filters whatsoever. And she didn't fit into any boxes. She was a complete character. She was kind of an anti-Semite herself, despite her upbringing. And part of I think this part of the message, not that there's a message that I've specifically intended, but it's important to remember that everybody brings a lot of individuality to their own lives, right? Despite being in this category or that category or whatever. And so that's part of what I wanted to do is, kind of offer that reminder. Um, the other thing is that, as I think I mentioned earlier, I've always been struck by the randomness of how, my family ended up being a family and being here in Toronto. Um, and this is not unique to my family at all. There are lots and lots of people who had identical experiences. It was just like a roll of the dice crapshoot of what their lives became. And I think that there's a lot of it's worthwhile considering that to really sort of sit with the randomness of what we have, what of how we got here, and then appreciate the incredible good fortune of coming out at the other end of that.
Being the son of Holocaust survivors, did that have any influence on the way you responded to the atrocities of October 7th in Israel?
So this is a good question. So I was writing about one part of 1944 on October 7th, and so that was a pretty challenging experience that I don't hope to do again anytime soon. I found uh, watching that, what's played out there to be, uh, you know, incredibly conflicting. It's a horrendous thing that happened on October 7th. I'm not a big fan of how the Israelis have handled Gaza. Um, and,
But can I just interject, John, for a second? Excuse me. Actually, what I meant to add to the question was not simply the atrocities of October 7th, but also the kind of tsunami of anti-Semitism that it's unleashed since then. So it's kind of a two
yeah,
parts to the question.
No, and so I'm actually working on a story about that for Walrus Magazine at the moment. And uh, it's I don't think that this is a an original observation, but I grew up at a time when it just wasn't a thing, right? Like I mean, there was bits and pieces here and there, but it wasn't something that was in the air. Now, it's in the air. Um, I think that Canadian authorities are pretty good about sort of trying to hold the line about anti-Semitism. I mean, this is a point that's much debated, but that's my general view. And uh, so it was, I've put this in the book that um, writing about this period, when all of this has been happening, has really brought a sharp focus to what I was writing. I should say, and I think this is very important, that the book is not a message of any sort. Like I've been thinking about this project for 30 years and started it well before October 7th. Um, but it's good to remember how, little things can turn into big things. How, a group of people, a segment of society that was extremely, extremely comfortable, you know, went to peril in a dozen years. So so that is a takeaway. That's a for sure. It's a takeaway.
Before we turn to some questions from our audience, we did promise that we're going to be giving some copies of John's book away. And to do that, we're going to ask 4 questions to the audience. And the way it works is the first person who answers accurately in the chat box will receive a copy of No Jews Live Here. So I'll get to the questions right now. First question. What notorious senior Nazi official arrived in Hungary in late March 1944 to oversee the ruthlessly efficient genocidal campaign against the country's then very large Jewish community? And I'll read the answers after we turn to some questions from the audience. Question number 2. The late Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg is, of course, the best known foreign diplomat who heroically saved many Jews in Budapest late in the war. The question now is, what other foreign diplomat based in Budapest is also credited with saving the lives of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews? And I'll give you a clue. He came from Switzerland. Okay, that's question number 2. Question number 3. In October 1940, Hungary joined Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan in the Axis alliance, fighting the Allies. What were the other 4 European countries that, like Hungary, joined the Axis alliance? Okay. And the fourth and final question. Of the approximately 825,000 Jews living in Hungary in 1941, how many survived the Holocaust? Okay, so again, put your answers in the chat box, and we'll get to those answers shortly. Now let's see if there's any questions we have from our audience. I'm just going to go to the chat box and let's see what we have. We have a question from Robert Samory, who says, you spoke of your mother's views when at age 11, she was told of her Jewish heritage. How did you feel when your identity changed at age 10? And how does that inform your self-perspective now? How does your non-Jewish identity impact you today?
So when I was told this, it didn't have an emotional impact on me. It was a piece of information my father shared and didn't elaborate too much on. And that said, don't tell anybody. I was growing up in North Toronto and there were no Jewish people in North Toronto. So it was sort of very decontextualized. And it was completely different than with my mother. I, you know, I'd be lying if I said that a 10-year-old has any sort of clear sense of identity. As a kid, I played a lot of ball hockey. Um, and, uh, I knew that I lived in Canada. I knew that my parents had come from Hungary. And, that was sort of about it. And then there was this additional piece of information. And, as I got older and I learned more, that kind of adds to it. It also sparked my curiosity. I was very curious about why I should keep this secret and what the secret consisted of. And that's, a thing that has motivated me to find out more and do a lot of reading and research.
Okay, I see. Because of time, I'm going to get to the answers of the questions. So before I do, it's your last chance to put in what you think are the correct answers. Okay. Okay, I'll get back now to the questions to remind everybody what question one was. What notorious senior Nazi official arrived in Hungary in late March 1944 to oversee the ruthlessly efficient genocidal campaign against Hungarian Jews? Okay. I see a number of you already guessed correctly. The answer is the infamous Adolf Eichmann in his role as the chief organizer of the so-called final solution to exterminate European Jewry. The second question was, the late Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg is the best known foreign diplomat who heroically saved many Jews in Budapest late in the Second World War. And the question was, what other foreign diplomat based in Budapest is also credited with saving tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews? And the clue I gave you was he was from Switzerland. And I see also a number of you did answer correctly. In 1942, Karl Lutz was appointed the Swiss vice consul in Budapest. He issued Swiss safe conduct documents that enabled nearly 10,000 Hungarian Jewish children to immigrate. And by the time of the liberation of Hungary in 1945, he saved more than 62,000 Jews. Question number 3. In October 1940, Hungary joined Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan in the Axis alliance fighting the Allies. What were the other 4 European countries that, like Hungary, joined the Axis alliance? The 4 other countries were Bulgaria, Croatia, Romania, and Slovakia. Last question. Of the approximately 825,000 Jews living in Hungary in 1941, how many survived the Holocaust? It's quite sobering. Approximately 250,000 Jews survived, meaning more than 2/3 of Hungarian Jews, or 565,000 Jews, were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. And with that, that brings us to the close of this segment of FSWC's Book Talk series. I want to thank everyone again for joining us, especially our special guest, John Lorinc, for being with us. For anyone interested in purchasing No Jews Live Here, and I do recommend the book, if you are tuning in from Canada, you can purchase it in most bookstores, or it's also available online. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for future segments of Book Talks. And we really are interested in your feedback. And if you have any comments or any suggestions for authors and new books that you think we should consider featuring in Book Talk, please let us know. So now, on behalf of friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, thank you again for being with us, and have a good night. And thank you again, John. Yeah, John, you want to say anything else in closing?
If anybody I saw there were a bunch of questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. If any of you have questions that you'd like to direct to me, direct it to Robert and through the Wiesenthal Center, and I'll give him permission to just forward them to me, and I'll respond directly by email.
Great. Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you to everybody for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you for the next segment of Book Talk. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.